There was a time in America when walking into a grocery store did not guarantee you would find what you wanted. The shelves existed, the stores were open, people carried money, but many foods simply were not available whenever families wanted them. During World War II, the American government introduced rationing programs that completely changed everyday life. Millions of families suddenly needed ration books just to buy ordinary items they once took for granted. Mothers carefully counted sugar cubes. Children learned not to waste leftovers. Grocery shopping became stressful, competitive, and sometimes emotional. People stood in long lines hoping shipments would arrive before supplies disappeared, and often they didn't. For modern audiences, it may sound unbelievable that Americans once struggled to buy foods now considered ordinary, but during wartime, much of the nation's food supply had to support soldiers fighting overseas. Certain products became difficult to transport, others required ingredients desperately needed by the military. So Americans adapted. They reused scraps, they grew victory gardens, they invented strange recipes, and they learned to survive without foods they once loved. Some ration foods became symbols of sacrifice and patriotism. Others became sources of frustration that families complained about constantly. But every single item on this list tells the story of how deeply World War II changed life inside American homes. 1. Sugar. If there was one food item Americans missed most during World War II rationing, it was sugar. Today, sugar feels almost unlimited. It hides inside sodas, snacks, desserts, cereals, sauces, and countless processed foods. But during the 1940s, sugar suddenly became precious. The reason was enormous wartime demand. Sugar was needed for military food supplies, canned goods, medical products, and overseas shipments supporting Allied forces. Transportation problems also made importing sugar far more difficult during the war. As a result, the U.S. government introduced strict sugar rationing. Families received ration books containing stamps controlling how much sugar they could purchase each month, and the amounts were small, very small. For many households, sugar disappeared almost immediately after grocery shopping. Parents carefully measured every spoonful. Children learned quickly that wasting sugar was unacceptable. Desserts changed completely. Birthday cakes became smaller. Cookies contained less sweetness. Candy nearly vanished in many homes. Even coffee tasted different because families tried stretching sugar supplies as long as possible. Some Americans became incredibly creative trying to replace sugar, honey, molasses, corn syrup, maple syrup. People experimented with anything capable of adding sweetness to recipes. Cookbooks from the wartime era often advertised ration-friendly desserts. Children suffered emotionally from sugar shortages more than adults sometimes realized. Candy stores looked emptier. Chocolate bars became harder to find. Simple treats once connected with childhood suddenly became rare luxuries. Many kids spent months dreaming about desserts they could barely eat anymore. Some families even locked sugar containers away to prevent children from secretly taking extra spoonfuls. That shows how valuable sugar became. Black markets also appeared. Certain people illegally sold extra sugar at extremely high prices to desperate families. The government warned Americans repeatedly against hoarding supplies. Still, many families panicked whenever grocery shelves looked empty. One fascinating detail about wartime sugar rationing was how deeply it changed cooking habits permanently. People learned to bake differently. Recipes became less sweet overall. Even after rationing ended, older generations often continued using sugar more carefully because wartime habits stayed emotionally powerful. Many Americans who lived through the war later admitted they never again looked at sugar as ordinary. It transformed from simple into precious. 2. Butter. Another food Americans desperately struggled to buy during wartime rationing was butter. For generations before the war, butter had been a normal part of daily American cooking. Families spread it on toast, used it in baking. Then suddenly, during World War II, butter became difficult to obtain. The military required enormous amounts of dairy products for soldiers overseas. Labor shortages affected farms because many workers left for military service. This created serious butter shortages. The government responded with rationing. Families received limited amounts based on ration coupons, and stores often sold out quickly after deliveries arrived. People stood in long grocery lines hoping butter shipments had not already disappeared. Sometimes they arrived too late. Children remembered hearing parents argue about how to stretch butter supplies longer. Mothers reused every small piece carefully. Nothing could be wasted. Some families switched heavily toward margarine instead, but wartime margarine looked and tasted very different from modern versions. Families had to knead yellow coloring into margarine manually at home. Children often helped mix the coloring by squeezing bags with their hands. For many Americans, The taste difference felt depressing. Butter symbolized comfort. Margarine felt like a forced wartime substitute. Baking changed dramatically because butter shortages affected cakes, cookies, and desserts. Recipes became simpler. A simple piece of bread with real butter started feeling luxurious. Many older Americans never forgot the excitement of finally getting fresh butter. 3. Coffee. For millions of Americans, one of the hardest wartime shortages involved coffee. Morning coffee routines were deeply connected to everyday American life. Coffee represented comfort, energy, and routine. Then wartime shipping problems changed everything. Much American coffee came from overseas imports, especially from Latin America. Coffee quickly became rationed. Families had to measure coffee carefully instead of brewing endless pots. People reused grounds multiple times. The second or third pot often tasted weak and bitter. Still, families drank it because alternatives felt worse. Some Americans experimented with substitutes: roasted barley, chicory root, burnt grains. Many hated the taste immediately. Restaurants also reduced serving sizes. Some diners stopped offering free refills entirely because coffee became too valuable. One fascinating aspect of wartime coffee rationing was emotional dependence. Coffee was not just food. It was routine, comfort, normalcy for meat. One of the biggest changes Americans experienced during wartime rationing involved meat. Before World War II, meat played a major role in traditional American meals: beef roasts, pork chops, hamburgers, bacon. The military required massive quantities of meat for soldiers fighting overseas. Feeding millions of troops placed enormous pressure on production. As a result, civilians faced strict meat rationing. Families received ration stamps limiting purchases, and certain cuts became extremely difficult to find. The shortages changed eating habits. Families began using smaller portions. Vegetables and beans appeared more frequently. Stews became popular because tiny amounts of meat could flavor large meals. Mothers learned to stretch ground beef using breadcrumbs or oats. Many families saved bacon grease carefully instead of throwing it away because every bit of flavor mattered during shortages. Spam also grew enormously popular because canned meats lasted longer and remained easier to distribute. 5. Chocolate. Perhaps no rationed food disappointed American children more than chocolate. Chocolate became critically important for military rations because it provided energy and boosted soldier morale. Factories shifted toward military production that reduced civilian availability. Children stared at empty candy shelves. Even simple chocolate cookies felt special during wartime. Some families rationed candy within households, so supplies lasted longer. Creative substitutes appeared everywhere: carob, molasses, desserts, vanilla cakes without cocoa. But many admitted nothing truly replaced chocolate. A single chocolate bar could feel almost priceless. For millions of American families, that shortage became one of the strongest memories of wartime rationing. As World War II continued, Americans slowly realized rationing was not temporary inconvenience. It became a completely new way of life. Families carried ration books almost everywhere. Grocery shopping turned into strategy instead of routine. Parents planned meals days in advance, while children learned quickly that asking for extra portions often meant there was no extra food available. Some stores looked nearly empty by evening. Others limited how much customers could buy even with ration coupons. And across America, people discovered that foods once considered ordinary could suddenly become incredibly difficult to find. The shortages affected emotions as much as stomachs. Holiday meals changed. Birthday celebrations became simpler. Favorite snacks disappeared. Even restaurants struggled to keep menus consistent because supplies changed constantly. Yet, despite all the frustration, most Americans accepted rationing because they understood the reason behind it. Soldiers overseas needed food first. The war effort came before comfort. Still, that did not stop families from missing the foods they once enjoyed freely, and some shortages became unforgettable. Number 6. Cheese. One food many Americans struggled to buy during wartime rationing was cheese. Today, cheese feels almost unlimited in grocery stores, but during World War II, cheese became much harder to obtain consistently. The military required enormous amounts of dairy products for soldiers. Cheese lasted longer than fresh milk and transported efficiently. As wartime demand increased, civilian access decreased. Certain types of cheese nearly disappeared from shelves in some areas. Children noticed quickly because cheese had become deeply connected with sandwiches, snacks, and school lunches. Macaroni and cheese dinners became less common. Even pizza, which was far less common in America at the time, became difficult to make properly because mozzarella supplies were limited. Officials promoted ration-friendly meals using smaller cheese portions stretched with bread, potatoes, or vegetables. Families became creative. Some grated tiny amounts of cheese across large casseroles just to add flavor. Wasting cheese felt unacceptable. Number 7. Eggs. Before the war, eggs were everyday breakfast foods found in nearly every kitchen. Then wartime pressures changed everything. Transportation problems and labor shortages affected farms. As a result, eggs became harder to obtain consistently. Cakes, cookies, and pastries traditionally required eggs, but shortages forced Americans to invent substitutes like applesauce or mashed bananas. Cookbooks from the era became filled with eggless cake recipes advertised as patriotic and practical. Families with backyard chickens gained enormous advantages. Fresh eggs from home flocks became extremely valuable. Number 8. Canned fruit. Before the war, canned peaches and pears were common. Then wartime demand transformed canned goods into strategic resources. The military depended on canned foods because they transported easily overseas. As a result, civilians found canned fruit increasingly difficult to buy. Fruit cocktails disappeared from dinner tables. Many mothers carefully saved cans of fruit for birthdays or Christmas. Victory gardens became more important than ever. Families canned homemade fruits whenever possible. Some children spent summers helping parents preserve berries manually because store-bought canned fruit remained too difficult to find. Number 9. Cooking oil during wartime. Oils and fats became critically important resources for both food and industrial military use. Families reused oil repeatedly. Bacon grease became especially valuable. Many households kept metal containers near stoves for saving leftover grease. The government even encouraged citizens to save fats because certain materials could support wartime manufacturing. Number 10. White bread. For decades, soft white bread was America's popular food. Then wartime nutrition policies changed everything. The government encouraged Americans to eat enriched whole-grain breads. As a result, commercial bakers faced restrictions on white bread. Children complained because darker breads looked unfamiliar. School lunches changed noticeably. Sandwiches suddenly appeared on brown bread. Wartime changes felt like another reminder that everyday life was no longer the same. Today, grocery stores contain endless bread varieties, but during World War II, even simple white bread became harder to buy consistently. For millions of Americans, that small change symbolized how deeply rationing transformed ordinary life.
As World War II continued, Americans slowly realized rationing was not temporary inconvenience. It became a completely new way of life. Families carried ration books almost everywhere. Grocery shopping turned into strategy instead of routine. Parents planned meals days in advance, while children learned quickly that asking for extra portions often meant there simply was no extra food available. Some stores looked nearly empty by evening. Others limited how much customers could buy even with ration coupons. And across America, people discovered that foods once considered ordinary could suddenly become incredibly difficult to find. The shortages affected emotions as much as stomachs. Holiday meals changed. Birthday celebrations became simpler. Favorite snacks disappeared. Even restaurants struggled to keep menus consistent because supplies changed constantly. Yet despite all the frustration, most Americans accepted rationing because they understood the reason. Soldiers overseas needed food first. The war effort came before comfort. Still, that did not stop families from missing the foods they once enjoyed freely. One food many Americans struggled to buy during wartime rationing was cheese. Today, cheese feels almost unlimited in grocery stores. Cheddar, Swiss, American mozzarella. Entire aisles exist dedicated to dairy products. But during World War II, cheese became much harder to obtain consistently. The military required enormous amounts of dairy products for soldiers serving overseas. Cheese lasted longer than fresh milk and transported efficiently. As wartime demand increased, civilian access decreased. Certain types of cheese nearly disappeared from shelves in some areas. Families often had to settle for whatever variety stores happened to receive. Some weeks there was none at all. Children noticed quickly because cheese had become deeply connected with sandwiches, snacks, and school lunches. Macaroni and cheese dinners became less common. Cheese crackers disappeared from many homes. Even pizza, which was far less common at the time, became difficult to make because mozzarella was limited. One fascinating aspect of wartime cheese shortages involved government encouragement. Officials promoted ration-friendly meals using smaller cheese portions stretched with vegetables. Families became incredibly creative. Some grated tiny amounts of cheese across large casseroles just to add flavor. Another major shortage affecting American families involved eggs. Before the war, eggs were everyday breakfast foods found in nearly every kitchen. Then wartime pressures changed everything. Eggs became essential not only for civilian meals but also for military food systems. As a result, eggs became harder to obtain consistently. Some grocery stores limited how many cartons customers could buy. During wartime, eggs became precious enough that every cracked shell mattered. One fascinating effect involved baking. Cakes and pastries required eggs. But shortages forced Americans to invent substitutes. Applesauce, mashed bananas, cornstarch mixtures. Families with backyard chickens suddenly gained enormous advantages. Fresh eggs from home flocks became extremely valuable. One of the most frustrating wartime shortages for American families involved canned fruit. The military depended heavily on canned foods because they transported easily overseas and lasted much longer than fresh produce. Victory gardens became more important than ever. Families canned homemade fruits whenever possible. Another item Americans suddenly struggled to buy was cooking oil. Today, bottles of vegetable oil line entire grocery shelves. Bacon grease became especially valuable. Many households kept metal containers near stoves specifically for saving leftover grease. Perhaps one of the strangest wartime changes involved white bread. The government encouraged Americans to eat more nutritious whole-grain breads. Today, grocery stores contain endless bread varieties, but during World War II, even simple white bread became a symbol of how rationing transformed ordinary life.
As the war dragged on, Americans became increasingly aware that rationing was affecting nearly every corner of daily life. At first, many families believed shortages would last only a short time, but months turned into years. Children grew older under rationing systems. Parents developed entirely new cooking habits. Even grocery stores looked different than they had before the war began. Bright, colorful displays became smaller. Certain shelves stayed empty for days. Customers rushed inside the moment delivery trucks arrived. People learned quickly that wartime shortages were unpredictable. One week a product appeared everywhere. The next week it vanished completely. Families adapted however they could. But some foods remained especially frustrating to lose because they had once felt so ordinary. And during World War II, Americans discovered just how emotional food shortages could become. Bacon. Few foods became more emotionally important during wartime rationing than bacon. Before World War II, it represented comfort breakfasts across America. Children woke up to the smell drifting through kitchens. Then rationing changed everything. Pork products became heavily needed for military food supplies overseas. As military demand increased, civilian access decreased. Mothers saved every drop of bacon grease because nothing could be wasted. Because bacon aroma remained so recognizable, the smell itself became associated with rarity. Restaurants adapted to breakfast platters shrank. Candy. If chocolate shortages disappointed children, overall candy shortages became even worse. Before the war, candy stores played huge roles in childhood culture. Sugar shortages affected nearly every type of candy production. Some candy bars disappeared entirely. Children stared through shop windows at half-empty displays. Many civilians accepted shortages more willingly because they knew candy shipments often went overseas to boost troop morale. Fresh fish. Another food many Americans struggled to buy consistently was fresh fish. Fuel restrictions and military service affected fishing industries. Coastal areas fared better, but inland communities struggled. One fascinating detail involved canned fish like tuna and sardines, which remained important. Breakfast cereals. One surprisingly important category affected was breakfast cereal. Families relied on boxed cereals for convenience and affordability. Certain grains were needed for military use. Boxes became smaller. Hot oatmeal became more common because oats remained relatively affordable. Mayonnaise. One food item many unexpectedly struggled to find was mayonnaise. It depended on eggs and oils, which faced severe shortages. Many families started making mayonnaise manually. Wartime necessity encouraged creativity. Sandwich shops reduced portions, and certain salads disappeared. For many, these missing foods symbolized how ordinary comforts kept disappearing. Americans understood no food was too ordinary to become precious during wartime.
By the later years of World War II, rationing no longer felt temporary to most Americans. It had become normal life. Children carried ration books almost as casually as school supplies. Parents planned meals around coupons instead of cravings. Families saved leftovers automatically because wasting food during wartime felt almost shameful. The emotional effect of shortages grew stronger over time. People did not just miss luxury foods anymore. They missed routine, the feeling of opening a pantry without worrying, the ability to cook favorite meals whenever they wanted. Even grocery shopping itself became stressful because nobody knew what stores would actually have in stock. Some Americans woke up before sunrise to stand in lines for deliveries. Others traveled across neighborhoods searching for simple ingredients. Throughout the country, families learned difficult lessons about scarcity. Foods once considered ordinary suddenly felt valuable enough to protect carefully. One food many Americans struggled to buy was jam and jelly. Before the war, fruit preserves were staples in countless homes. Children spread jelly across toast before school. Families made peanut butter and jelly sandwiches constantly. Breakfast tables often contained several jars at once. Then wartime shortages changed everything. Sugar rationing hit jam production especially hard because preserves required large amounts of sweetener. At the same time, canned and preserved fruits became increasingly important for military supplies overseas. As demand rose and ingredients tightened, store shelves began emptying. Certain flavors disappeared completely for periods of time. Families often bought whatever preserves they could find. Grape jelly vanished in some areas. Strawberry jam became difficult to obtain. Orange marmalade turned into an occasional luxury. Children noticed immediately because sandwiches changed. School lunches became less exciting. One fascinating detail about wartime jam shortages involved home preservation. Families who grew fruits in victory gardens started making homemade jams, but even then, sugar shortages made preserving difficult. Some recipes used honey or syrup substitutes instead. Others reduced sweetness entirely just to stretch supplies. Neighbors often exchanged jars or traded preserves depending on available ingredients. That community cooperation became important. Restaurants and diners also struggled. Breakfast menus changed because jelly packets became harder to supply. Many older Americans later remembered wartime jelly shortages vividly. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches had once symbolized comfort and routine. Another major shortage that shocked American children involved soda pop. Soft drinks already held enormous popularity across the United States. Kids drank sodas at movie theaters. Families bought bottles for picnics. Teenagers gathered around soda fountains after school. Then wartime rationing changed the entire industry. Sugar shortages hit soda companies hard because soft drinks depended heavily on sweeteners. Bottle production also faced problems because glass and metal resources became increasingly important for the war effort. Transportation systems prioritized military needs. As a result, soda availability became inconsistent. Some brands disappeared temporarily. Children often found empty soda coolers where favorite drinks once filled shelves. One fascinating aspect involved vending machines. Machines that once stayed fully stocked sometimes sat partially empty for days. Movie theaters and diners also struggled. Some restaurants diluted fountain drinks, trying to stretch syrup supplies further. Customers definitely noticed. Families adapted creatively. Homemade lemonade and flavored drinks became more common. Some children drank water or milk instead because soda was not available. Advertisements often encouraged Americans to accept shortages patriotically. Most civilians understood, but disappointment remained real, especially for children. Many older Americans later described how exciting it felt whenever stores restocked favorite sodas again. Even a bottle of cola could suddenly feel special. One category Americans deeply missed was bakery pastries and butter cookies. Before the war, bakeries sold enormous varieties of treats. Then rationing disrupted everything. Butter became limited. Sugar became rationed. Egg shortages affected baking heavily. As a result, many bakeries reduced production or simplified recipes. Fancy pastries nearly disappeared. Butter cookies became harder to find. Bakers experimented constantly using fewer rationed ingredients. Molasses replaced sugar. Shortening replaced butter. Fruit fillings stretched pastries further. Holiday traditions changed too. Christmas cookie trays became smaller. Birthday desserts looked simpler. Wedding pastries lost elaborate decorations. Another shortage involved spices and flavorings. During World War II, global trade disruptions changed access to seasonings dramatically. Ingredients like cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, and vanilla became harder to obtain. Families suddenly noticed meals tasting plainer. One fascinating detail involved Christmas baking. Holiday desserts traditionally relied heavily on cinnamon and nutmeg. Pepper became valuable enough that families carefully controlled how much was used. Home cooks experimented with local herbs. Older Americans later described wartime kitchens as feeling emotionally quieter because favorite aromas disappeared. Smell connects strongly with comfort. One of the most important shortages involved fresh milk. Milk had always been essential. Children drank it daily. Wartime pressures complicated dairy distribution. The military required enormous amounts. Labor shortages affected farms as workers entered service. Schools worried especially because children depended on milk for nutrition. Some cafeterias switched toward powdered milk. Parents saved milk for younger children first whenever supplies tightened. Morning cereal routines changed in some households. Wartime milk delivery traditions were disrupted. Some households received less milk or experienced irregular deliveries. Warm milk before bed, cold milk with cookies, all became less certain. Restaurants and soda fountains also struggled. Milk-based desserts like milkshakes and ice cream required ingredients becoming increasingly valuable. Older Americans remembered this vividly. Unlike luxury foods, milk represented something basic, essential, necessary. And during World War II, Americans learned even the most essential foods could suddenly become difficult to obtain.
As World War II pushed forward, rationing became more than just a government system. It became part of American identity. Families measured patriotism through sacrifice. Saving food mattered. Avoiding waste mattered. People proudly reused leftovers, planted victory gardens, and learned to survive with less because they believed those sacrifices supported soldiers overseas. But even with strong national unity, shortages remained emotionally exhausting. Parents missed cooking favorite meals. Children missed treats, restaurants struggled to stay open, and grocery shopping often felt like a stressful competition against time and limited supplies. Americans adapted constantly, yet certain foods continued standing out because their absence changed everyday life in surprisingly powerful ways. 26. Chicken today. Chicken is one of the most common meats in America. Fast food restaurants serve billions of chicken meals every year. Families buy chicken routinely without much thought. But during World War II, chicken became far harder to obtain consistently for ordinary civilians. At first, some Americans believed chicken shortages would not become serious because beef and pork received more attention in rationing discussions. But wartime realities affected poultry heavily too. Transportation systems became strained. Feed supplies fluctuated. Farm labor shortages increased because many workers joined military service or defense industries. As demand grew, civilian access tightened. Fresh chicken became expensive and difficult to find in many communities. Families often saved poultry for holidays or special dinners. Children noticed because fried chicken dinners once associated with comfort and celebration became rarer. Restaurants adapted carefully. One fascinating aspect of wartime chicken shortages involved backyard farming. More American families began raising chickens at home whenever possible. Government campaigns encouraged citizens to grow and produce food locally whenever possible. Families also learned to stretch chicken further. Soups, stews, casseroles, tiny amounts of meat flavored large meals feeding entire households. Nothing could be wasted. Even chicken bones were reused for broth. Older Americans later remembered wartime chicken shortages vividly because poultry had once seemed dependable. 27. White rice. Another food Americans increasingly struggled to buy during wartime was white rice. Rice mattered not only as civilian food but also as military ration material because it stored well and transported efficiently. Global shipping disruptions complicated imports heavily. As a result, certain types of rice became harder to find consistently. Families sometimes visited multiple stores searching for simple bags of white rice. Restaurants adjusted recipes whenever supplies fluctuated. One fascinating detail about wartime rice shortages involved substitution. Families stretched rice using potatoes, breadcrumbs, or oats. Asian American communities often felt shortages, especially strongly because rice played central roles in cultural cooking traditions. 28. Chewing gum. One surprisingly emotional wartime shortage involved chewing gum. Chewing gum depended on ingredients like sugar and latex-based materials that became increasingly valuable during the war. Children noticed immediately. Candy counters looked emptier. Small pleasures connected with daily routines vanished one by one. One fascinating detail involved soldiers overseas. Chewing gum became important in military rations because it relieved stress and boosted morale. 29. Canned soup. One food category Americans relied on heavily before the war was canned. Soup, quick, cheap, convenient. Then wartime pressures changed canned food production. The military required enormous quantities because they lasted long and transported efficiently. Homemade soups became more common because canned versions could no longer be trusted as dependable pantry items. 30. Lemons. Another fruit Americans deeply missed during wartime shortages was lemons. Fuel mattered. Shipping priorities changed. Rail systems focused increasingly on military operations. Fresh lemons became harder to obtain. Children especially noticed because lemonade had long been associated with summer. Suddenly, homemade lemonade became less common. Older Americans later remembered wartime lemon shortages vividly. Their disappearance symbolized how completely everyday life had changed.